"If you don't save me tonight," the words escaped her cracked lips like a prayer to an indifferent sky. Luke found her collapsed against his fence post, blood seeping through torn buckskin, her dark eyes holding secrets that could destroy or redeem. She clutched a leather pouch against her chest as if it contained her very soul. The Apache woman's breathing came in shallow gasps, each one possibly her last. In the dying light of the desert evening, she whispered of innocence and betrayal, of a father facing execution for crimes he never committed. Subscribe now to discover if Luke's choice will save 2 lives or damn them both. Her fingers loosened around the pouch, and Luke realized he was staring at destiny itself. The sun bled crimson across the Arizona horizon when Luke heard the sound that would change everything. Not the familiar whistle of wind through canyon walls or the distant cry of a hawk, but something broken and human. He set down his hammer, the fence post half driven into the stubborn earth, and listened. There it was again. A soft moan carried on the evening breeze, like a ghost's lament. His weathered hands instinctively moved to the Colt at his hip as he stepped away from his work, boots crunching on the dry grass that stretched endlessly toward the mountains. The sound led him to the eastern edge of his property, where his fence line met the open desert. There, crumpled against a wooden post like a discarded doll, lay a woman. Her long black hair spilled across the ground like spilled ink, and her buckskin dress was torn and stained with blood that looked black in the fading light. She was Apache. He could tell from the intricate beadwork on her moccasins and the silver bracelet that caught the last rays of sunlight. Her breathing was so shallow he had to lean close to be sure she was alive. When he knelt beside her, her eyes fluttered open, revealing depths of pain and desperation that made his chest tighten. They were the darkest brown he had ever seen, like pools of coffee in the bottom of a cup, and they held an intelligence that cut through her obvious suffering. She tried to speak, her lips moving soundlessly at first, then forming words so quiet he had to bend his ear to her mouth to hear them. The warmth of her breath against his skin sent an unexpected shiver down his spine. "Please," she whispered, and the word carried the weight of a lifetime's worth of prayers. "If you don't save me tonight, I will die." Her voice was like wind through dry leaves, fragile but persistent. She struggled to lift her head, and he saw the effort it cost her, the way her face contorted with pain. "My father. They will kill him at the full moon. 3 days. Her hand moved weakly toward something pressed against her chest, and Luke saw she clutched a small leather pouch with desperate intensity. Luke had lived alone on this ranch for 8 years, speaking to no one but his horses and the occasional traveling merchant. He had chosen solitude after the war, after watching too many good men die for causes that seemed to shift like desert sand. The sight of this broken woman stirred something in him that he had thought long dead, a protective instinct that made his hands gentle as he checked her injuries. Her left leg was badly wounded, the buckskin torn to reveal a deep gash that still seeped blood. "Can you stand?" he asked, though he could see the answer in her eyes. She shook her head slightly, and a tear traced a clean line down her dust-covered cheek. Luke made his decision in that moment, lifting her carefully in his arms, surprised by how light she felt, as if suffering had hollowed her out from the inside. As he carried her toward his cabin, she pressed the leather pouch against his chest, and he felt something hard and angular inside it, something that seemed to pulse with its own mysterious importance. The cabin felt different with another person inside it, smaller somehow, as if the walls had drawn closer to accommodate the presence of secrets. Luke laid her gently on his bed, the only bed in the single room that had been his entire world for nearly a decade. She looked impossibly fragile against the rough wool blankets, her copper skin pale with blood loss, her breathing still too shallow for comfort. He lit the oil lamp with hands that trembled slightly, casting dancing shadows across the log walls that had witnessed only his solitary existence. "What's your name?" he asked, as he gathered clean cloth and water, his voice rusty from disuse. She watched him move around the cabin, with eyes that seemed to catalogue every detail, as if memorizing the face of the man who might be her salvation. "Nieli," she whispered, and the name hung in the air between them like a bridge across an impossible chasm. "My father is Chief Running Bear. They say he sold weapons to the cavalry, but it is a lie." Her voice grew stronger with each word, fueled by a fierce loyalty that burned brighter than her fever. Luke knelt beside the bed and began cleaning her wound, his touch as gentle as he could manage, with hands more accustomed to handling rope and iron than human flesh. She bit her lip to keep from crying out, but he saw the way her fingers gripped the leather pouch, knuckles white with the effort of staying conscious. The gash was deep but clean, and he could see it would heal if infection didn't set in. As he worked, she spoke in fragments, her story emerging like pieces of a shattered mirror. "The real traitor. He gave me this," she said, pressing the pouch against her heart. "Proof of his guilt. But the tribal council meets in 3 days, when the moon is full. If I don't return—" Her voice broke, and Luke saw the terrible weight she carried, heavier than any physical burden. She was not just fighting for her own life, but for her father's honor, for justice itself. The responsibility seemed too large for someone so young, though he guessed she had seen more hardship than many men twice her age. "Who did this to you?" Luke asked, gesturing toward her leg as he began wrapping it with clean bandages. Neely's eyes darkened, and for a moment he saw not pain, but pure hatred flash across her features. "Marcus Whitfield and his men. They caught me 2 days' ride from here, tried to take the pouch. I escaped, but barely." She struggled to sit up, wincing as the movement pulled at her wound. "They will come looking for me. You are in danger now, just by helping me." Luke finished bandaging her leg and sat back on his heels, studying her face in the lamplight. She was beautiful, he realized, with high cheekbones and a mouth that probably smiled easily when not twisted with pain. But it was her eyes that held him, the way they seemed to see straight through to his soul, measuring him and finding him somehow worthy of her trust. "Let them come," he said quietly, and meant it. "This is my land, and you're under my protection now." The words surprised him with their certainty, as if some part of him had been waiting 8 years to say them. The dawn came pale and hesitant, like a woman unsure of her welcome. Luke had dozed fitfully in the wooden chair beside Nieli's makeshift bed, his rifle across his knees, ears tuned to every sound the desert might carry. She had slept deeply for the first time in weeks, her breathing steady and untroubled, the fever finally broken. When she stirred, her dark eyes found his immediately, as if she had known exactly where he would be. The morning light revealed the true extent of her exhaustion, the hollow beneath her cheekbones, the way her hands trembled slightly as she pushed herself upright. Yet there was something else there too, a quiet strength that had survived everything the desert and her enemies had thrown at her. "You stayed," she said simply, and Luke heard in those 2 words a lifetime of people who hadn't. He rose stiffly, his back protesting the night in the chair, and moved to stoke the fire that had burned low during the dark hours. The familiar ritual of adding kindling and coaxing flame gave his hands something to do while his mind wrestled with the strange tenderness that had taken root in his chest. He had spent 8 years learning to need nothing and no one, building walls as sturdy as the ones that surrounded his ranch. Now this woman, this stranger with her desperate mission and her unwavering faith in a father's innocence, had somehow found the one crack in his defenses. "Coffee?" he asked, because it was easier than examining the way her presence had already begun to change the very air in his cabin. She nodded, and he busied himself with the familiar morning routine, aware of her watching his every movement with the careful attention of someone who had learned to read danger in the smallest gestures. The coffee pot sang its quiet song over the flames, and Luke found himself remembering mornings when that sound had been the only voice in his world. Now it seemed to harmonize with something else. The soft rustle of Neely adjusting the blankets, the whisper of her breath, the almost inaudible sound of hope taking root in a place that had known only solitude. When he handed her the steaming cup, their fingers brushed for just a moment, and Luke felt something electric pass between them. Not desire exactly, though that was there too, but something deeper, recognition perhaps, of two souls who had learned to carry their burdens alone and were suddenly, impossibly, considering the radical notion of sharing the weight. Nieli's eyes held his for a heartbeat longer than necessary, and in that suspended moment, Luke understood that whatever happened next, whatever dangers they would face together, his life had already been irrevocably altered. The coffee was bitter and strong, exactly as he had always made it, but somehow it tasted different now, seasoned with possibility. "Tell me about your father," Luke said, settling back into his chair, with his own cup warming his hands. The request surprised him. He had never been a man for stories or confidences, but something in Nieli's face the night before, when she had spoken of the man she was trying to save, had lodged itself deep in his memory. She was quiet for a long moment, her gaze distant, as if she were looking across years instead of the small space of his cabin. When she finally spoke, her voice carried the weight of love and loss intertwined, the particular ache of a daughter who had watched her hero become the target of other men's hatred and fear. "He taught me to read the stars," she began, and Luke heard in those simple words the foundation of everything that had brought her to his door. Not just for direction, but for truth. He said the stars never lie, never change their stories to suit the powerful or the afraid. When the accusations came, when they said he had betrayed his own people for white man's gold, I knew it was impossible. My father would sooner cut out his own heart than betray the trust of his tribe. Her voice grew stronger as she spoke, fueled by a conviction that 8 years of exile and hardship had only deepened. Luke found himself leaning forward, drawn into her story despite himself, understanding for the first time that this was not just about saving one man's life. It was about preserving the very notion that truth could triumph over lies, that justice was more than just a word spoken by those with the power to enforce it. The second day brought visitors Luke had not expected and did not want. He was checking the fence line near the eastern boundary of his property when he saw the dust cloud rising in the distance, too large and too purposeful to be anything but trouble. His hand moved instinctively to the colt at his hip as he counted the riders. 6 men moving with the deliberate pace of those who knew exactly where they were going and what they intended to find when they got there. Luke's jaw tightened as he recognized the lead rider's silhouette, the particular way Marcus Thornfield sat his horse like a man who owned everything his shadow touched. Thornfield was a cattle baron with political ambitions and a reputation for getting what he wanted, regardless of who stood in his way. Luke rode hard back to the cabin, his mind racing through possibilities and preparations. Nieli was stronger today, able to move around the small space without the crippling pain that had marked her first night, but she was still in no condition to run or fight. He found her sitting by the window, the leather pouch clutched in her hands, her face pale with the kind of fear that came from knowing your enemies had found your trail. "They're coming," she said without turning around, and Luke realized she had been watching the horizon with the same vigilance that had kept her alive through weeks of pursuit. Her voice was steady, but he could see the tremor in her shoulders, the way her knuckles had gone white around the precious burden she carried. 6 riders, Luke confirmed, checking his rifle and counting the ammunition he had within easy reach. Thornfield's men, most likely. He's got interests in keeping certain truths buried, and your father's innocence would inconvenience a lot of powerful people. He moved efficiently around the cabin, securing anything that might be used as a weapon, positioning himself where he could see the approaching riders while keeping Nieli out of their direct line of sight. The familiar weight of his guns was comforting, but Luke knew that 6 against 1 were odds that even his considerable skill might not overcome. What troubled him more was the realization that he was no longer thinking only of his own survival. Somewhere in the space of 2 days, this woman's mission had become his own. The riders approached with the arrogant confidence of men who had never been told no, their horses kicking up clouds of dust that seemed to darken the very air around Luke's sanctuary. Thornfield himself rode at the front, his expensive hat and tailored clothes marking him as a man who preferred to let others do his dirty work, but was not above getting his hands bloody when the stakes were high enough. Luke stepped onto his porch, rifle held casually but ready, his presence a clear statement that these men were not welcome on his land. The silence stretched between them like a taut wire, filled with the weight of unspoken threats and the particular tension that preceded violence in the unforgiving mathematics of the West. "Luke Morrison," Thornfield called out, his voice carrying the false joviality of a politician addressing voters. "Heard you might be harboring something that doesn't belong to you. Something that could cause a lot of trouble for a lot of good people if it fell into the wrong hands." His smile was sharp as a blade, and Luke could see the calculation behind his eyes, the careful weighing of risk and reward that had made Thornfield rich and dangerous in equal measure. The other riders spread out slightly, a subtle but unmistakable positioning that spoke of men who had done this kind of work before and knew how to make problems disappear in the vast emptiness of the desert. Luke's response was measured, each word chosen with the precision of a man who understood that the wrong phrase could turn conversation into gunfire. "My land, my business," he said simply, but his tone carried the weight of 8 years of solitude and the hard-won knowledge that some lines once crossed could never be uncrossed. Behind him, he could feel Nieli's presence like a flame at his back, her courage and desperation lending strength to his own resolve. The morning sun climbed higher, casting sharp shadows that seemed to divide the world into territories of light and darkness, safety and danger, truth and the lies that powerful men told to keep their secrets buried in the desert sand. "Now, Luke," Thornfield continued, his voice taking on the patient tone of a man explaining simple facts to a slow child, "we both know you're a reasonable man. A man who understands that sometimes the greater good requires small sacrifices. The woman you're protecting, she's carrying something that could destabilize the entire territory, start a war that would cost hundreds of lives. Surely a man of your experience understands that one life, even an innocent life, isn't worth that kind of bloodshed." The words were carefully chosen, designed to appeal to Luke's sense of pragmatism and his knowledge of how quickly violence could spread across the frontier like wildfire. But Thornfield had miscalculated. He had assumed that 8 years of isolation had made Luke indifferent to justice, when in fact it had only clarified his understanding of what was worth fighting for. The standoff stretched like a held breath. 6 armed men against one, with the weight of truth balanced on the edge of a knife. Luke could feel the familiar calm that always descended on him in moments like these, the strange peace that came from knowing that the next few seconds would determine whether he lived or died. Behind him, Nieli had moved to the window, and though he couldn't see her, he could sense her presence like a steady flame, her unwavering faith in her father's innocence lending strength to his own resolve. The leather pouch she carried seemed to pulse with its own power, a small thing that contained the ability to topple empires built on lies and the blood of innocent men. Thornfield's patience was wearing thin, his politician's smile beginning to crack around the edges as he realized that Luke Morrison was not going to be bought, threatened, or reasoned into submission. "You're making a mistake, Morrison," he said, his voice dropping to the low, dangerous tone that had preceded the disappearance of other inconvenient obstacles to his ambitions. "This woman is a fugitive, wanted for theft and murder. You're harboring a criminal, and that makes you an accessory to her crimes. My men here are deputized to bring her in, dead or alive, and anyone who stands in the way of justice will be dealt with accordingly." The lie rolled off his tongue with practiced ease, but Luke had heard enough lies in his lifetime to recognize the particular cadence of desperation dressed up as authority. Justice, Luke repeated, tasting the word like something bitter. Funny how that word means different things to different people. To you, it means silencing a woman who carries proof of your crimes. To me, it means making sure the truth gets told, no matter who it inconveniences. His rifle shifted almost imperceptibly, a movement so small that only men who lived by violence would notice, but it was enough to change the entire dynamic of the confrontation. The riders tensed, hands moving closer to their weapons, the careful choreography of men who knew that the next few moments would be written in gunpowder and blood. The first shot came from Thornfield's lieutenant, a nervous man with quick hands and poor judgment who mistook Luke's stillness for weakness. The bullet splintered the porch post inches from Luke's head, and then the morning exploded into chaos. Luke's rifle spoke twice in rapid succession, and two riders tumbled from their saddles before their horses had time to shy away from the gunfire. He rolled behind the water trough as return fire peppered the front of his cabin, splinters of wood flying like angry wasps. Through the window, he could see Nieli pressed against the far wall, the leather pouch clutched against her chest, her eyes wide but determined. She had seen violence before, had lived with the constant threat of it for weeks, and she did not flinch from the sound of men dying for the truth she carried. The battle was brief but vicious, the kind of concentrated violence that the frontier bred in men who had learned that survival often came down to who could draw fastest and shoot straightest. Luke's years of solitude had not dulled his skills. If anything, the long hours of practice, the careful maintenance of his weapons, the constant awareness that danger could come from any direction, had honed him into something harder and more deadly than the man who had first retreated to this isolated ranch. When the gunsmoke cleared, 4 men lay still in the dust, and Thornfield himself sat his horse with blood running down his arm, his face pale with the realization that his carefully laid plans had crumbled into disaster. "This isn't over, Morrison," Thornfield snarled, clutching his wounded arm as he wheeled his horse around. "You've made an enemy today that will follow you to the grave. That woman's secret won't save her father. It'll only get more good men killed." But his words carried the hollow ring of a man who had already lost, who knew that his power depended on shadows and silence, and both had been shattered by the simple refusal of one man to step aside. Luke watched him ride away, knowing that this was indeed not over, that the forces arrayed against Nieli's mission were larger and more dangerous than one corrupt cattle baron. But something had changed in the space of those few violent minutes. Luke Morrison was no longer a man standing alone against the world. As the dust settled and the desert reclaimed its silence, Nieli emerged from the cabin, moving carefully, but with purpose. She knelt beside Luke, her hands gentle as she examined the graze on his shoulder, where one bullet had come too close, her touch carrying a tenderness that spoke of gratitude deeper than words. "You could have given me up," she said quietly, her voice thick with emotion. "You could have saved yourself and let them take me. Why didn't you?" Luke looked into her dark eyes, seeing there not just the reflection of his own face, but the mirror of his own soul. Another person who had learned to carry impossible burdens alone and was only now discovering the revolutionary possibility of sharing the weight. "Because," he said simply, his hand covering hers where it rested on his wounded shoulder, "some things are worth fighting for, and some truths are worth dying for." The words hung between them like a promise, and Luke realized that somewhere in the space of 3 days, his carefully constructed solitude had been transformed into something else entirely. A partnership forged in gunfire and sealed with the kind of trust that could only be earned through shared danger. The leather pouch still held its secrets, and the journey to deliver its truth was far from over, but Luke Morrison was no longer traveling that road alone.